She came west on a letter that was never written to marry a man who never sent it. He found her at dawn, bound and bleeding in the back of his own barn, a stranger he had never met left there by someone who wanted them both destroyed. He cut the rope. He carried her inside. And by the time she opened her eyes, three brothers and one woman from Boston were already standing at the edge of a war none of them had chosen. This is how it started. The barn door had not been opened since the night before. Jamie Harlow knew this the way a man knows the land he was raised on, the way he knows the sound of his own boots on hard-packed earth. He had latched that door himself at sundown, checked it twice out of the habit that comes from growing up with two older brothers who counted everything twice. The latch was still in place when he pressed his palm against the weathered wood that September morning, the sky behind him barely turning from black to the color of old iron. He had a bucket of water in one hand and a half-eaten biscuit in the other, and his mind was somewhere out on the north fence line where two posts had been leaning at a bad angle since last week's wind. He was thinking about fence posts and the coming cold, and whether the Patterson boys had any spare wire they could trade for. He was not thinking about anything that would have prepared him for what was on the other side of that door. He pushed it open. The hinges groaned once loud in the morning quiet. Pale light crept in across the straw-covered floor, reached the back corner of the barn, and there it stopped. A woman lay against the far wall. Her wrists were bound behind her back with rope. A strip of cloth had been pulled tight across her mouth. Her dress, the kind of navy blue traveling dress a woman wore when she was arriving somewhere important, was streaked with dust and something darker. There was dried blood above her left eyebrow, not much, but enough. Her head was tilted at the angle of someone who had not chosen to rest there. And her chest, Jamie watched it with the particular stillness of a man who has seen dead animals and knows the difference moved. Slowly, shallowly, but it moved. The bucket hit the ground. Ethan, he said it once, not loudly, in the way you call your older brother's name when the words to explain have not arrived yet, and the name will have to carry everything else. Then he was across the barn floor, and he was on his knees beside her. One hand already reaching to check the pulse at her throat, the other hand moving toward the rope at her wrists, and his voice had already dropped to the low, steady tone he used with frightened horses. "Easy now, easy, I've got you." She did not respond. She was alive. That was the only fact that mattered in that moment. "Ethan," this time he called it louder. Within 3 minutes, all three brothers stood in that barn. Ethan Harlow moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned a long time ago in places no one back home would ever see that panic was a luxury that got people killed. He cut the rope at her wrist with the knife from his belt in one clean motion, checked the wound above her eye with his thumb, and then looked up at Cole, who was standing in the doorway with an expression that could have meant 100 things and probably meant all of them at once. "She's alive," Ethan said. "Get water. Get it warm." Cole was already gone. Jamie had lowered the woman's head gently onto a folded piece of burlap he had pulled from the shelf without being asked. He was watching her breathe with the focused attention of a young man who has not yet learned to protect himself from caring. It was Ethan who found the letter. When he lifted her slightly to check that nothing had been broken, a folded piece of paper slipped from the inner pocket of her traveling coat and landed in the straw at his knees. He picked it up. He unfolded it. He read it in the thin morning light coming through the barn door. And then he read it again because the first time through a man's mind sometimes refuses to accept what his eyes are showing him. The handwriting was his own, or something close enough to his own that a stranger would not have known the difference. The letters had been copied with care. The slant matched the particular way he left his capital E slightly open at the top. Someone had studied his hand and practiced it. What the letter said in his voice and his name in a signature that looked exactly like his was that he had written to a young woman in Boston with promises he never intended to keep, that he had lured her west under false pretenses, that he would, and here the words had been chosen carefully to sound like the thoughts of a dangerous and dishonorable man, deal with her as he saw fit upon her arrival. Ethan folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at the woman in the straw. He looked at the letter-shaped weight against his chest. and in the particular silence of a man whose mind is moving very fast while the rest of him holds very still, he understood several things at once. Someone had written this letter in his name. Someone had used it to bring this woman west from Boston. Someone had put her in his barn, and the letter had been placed on her person, not dropped, not fallen, but placed so that whoever found her alongside it would find what appeared to be a confession. "That is not your handwriting," Cole said from the doorway. Ethan had not heard him come back. Cole had a way of moving quietly when he chose to, which was not often. "No," Ethan said, "but someone worked very hard to make it look like mine." Cole set the pot of warm water down beside Jamie. He straightened. He looked at the woman, then at Ethan, then at the letter in Ethan's pocket, and the muscle along his jaw moved the way it moved when he was arriving at a conclusion he did not like. "We carry her inside," Cole said. "We figure the rest out after." No one disagreed. They brought her to the cabin and laid her in the only proper bed in the house, the one in the main bedroom where Ethan slept, and not one of the three brothers said a word about this arrangement because there was nothing to say. Jamie built up the fire. Cole brought another blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed. Ethan sat in the chair by the window with the letter unfolded on the table in front of him and read it a third time, looking now, not for what it said, but for what it told him about the person who had written it. They knew this much: her name was Grace Whitmore. It was written on the small leather card inside her traveling bag. She had come from Boston, Massachusetts. She had come expecting to find someone named Ethan Harlow waiting for her. She had not expected the barn. Outside, the sun came fully up over the hills east of the property, and the Wyoming morning went on in its indifferent way, cold and clear and beautiful as mornings in that part of the world often do, regardless of what has happened in the night. For any of this, there had been a letter. Not the false one, the original. 3 weeks earlier, in Boston, Massachusetts, a young woman named Grace Whitmore had been sitting beside the window of her rented room on the third floor of a narrow building on Hanover Street, and she had been reading a letter for the third time. Not because she did not understand it. She understood it perfectly. She was reading it again because she was trying to decide something, and she had learned in 22 years of careful living that decisions made in a hurry tended to unravel in the same fashion. The letter was signed by a man named Ethan Harlow. He described himself as the owner of a working ranch in Wyoming Territory, 32 years of age, in need of a practical woman willing to make a life in difficult country. The advertisement she had responded to, placed in the Boston Morning Chronicle under the classified notices, had used spare language that appealed to her more than the flowery appeals she had seen in similar columns. No promises of grand houses or easy days. No descriptions of golden sunsets over boundless prairies written by men who had clearly never seen either. Just land, a roof, honest work, and fair treatment. In one sentence that she had underlined lightly in pencil before she caught herself doing it. "I will never lie to you, and I will never raise my hand against you. That much I can promise before God." Grace Whitmore was not a sentimental woman. She had been raised by a father who loved books, and by the hard reality of watching that father lose slowly and steadily everything those books had helped him build. Thomas Whitmore had been a decent merchant, once a man of measured success and good reputation on the waterfront. That was before the years of borrowing against the next season's expected returns, before the accounts that somehow never quite balanced, before the letters from Philadelphia that he slid under his ledger when she walked into the room. She had never told him she saw. That was also something she had learned young, the value of letting people believe they had kept their secrets. What she knew in the autumn of 1872 was that her father was in trouble, deeper than either of them had named aloud. She knew that men in well-made suits from cities she had never visited had begun appearing in their parlor with papers in their hands. She knew that her father looked older than he should, and that the fear in him which he was not skilled at hiding from a daughter who had been watching him for 2 decades was the specific fear of a man who owes something he cannot repay. She knew because she was Grace Whitmore, and she paid attention to things that if she remained in Boston much longer, her father would try to solve his problems by solving hers, meaning he would arrange something for her, something practical, from his perspective, and probably from the perspective of whichever creditor he was most anxious about, and she would become part of a negotiation she had never agreed to enter. She would not allow that. The letter from Wyoming was her answer before the question was asked. What she noticed reading it a third time by the window light was a small thing, a detail that sat in the back of her mind like a pebble in a boot present and mildly irritating, but not enough to stop walking. The postmark on the envelope showed the transit stamp from the Boston office clearly enough, but the originating mark, the stamp that should have shown Dry Creek or the nearest postal office in Wyoming territory, was smudged to near illegibility. She told herself this was not unusual. The Western postal system was not known for its precision. She folded the letter, she set it on the table, she looked out the window at the gray September sky over Boston Harbor. Then she opened her writing desk and began composing a reply. There were things she packed into her traveling trunk that a woman in her position was expected to pack, and things she packed that a woman in her position was not expected to need: her mother's Bible, 3 dresses, the Navy traveling dress, a practical gray wool, and one better dress in case circumstances required it, her writing journal, small and leather-bound, in which she had kept observations since she was 14, a set of sewing tools, enough money for emergencies sewn into the hem of her traveling coat, and a small folding knife in a leather sheath, the kind used for cutting cord and rope, and whatever else needed cutting, which the old cook, Mrs. Flanagan, had given her 2 years ago, with the instruction to keep it where she could reach it and not tell her father. She went to say goodbye to Thomas Whitmore the morning she left. He was standing at the kitchen table pretending to read a newspaper when she came downstairs with her trunk, and he looked up at her with the eyes of a man who has been awake since before the dawn and knows something he is not going to say. He was 54 years old, and he looked 60 in that particular morning, light with the newspaper creased the wrong way in his hands because he had not actually been reading it. He crossed the room and embraced her and held on a moment longer than their usual farewells required. "Be careful, Grace," he said. "Trust what your eyes show you, not what you want to believe." She had heard him say things like this before. He was a man who sometimes spoke in the shapes of things rather than the things themselves. She filed the words away and kissed his cheek and went to the door. She did not see him stand at the kitchen window watching her walk down the street toward the hired carriage. She did not see him reach into his coat pocket and take out a small card with an address in Philadelphia printed on it and look at it for a long time before setting it on the windowsill with the deliberate care of a man making a decision he has already made. What she did not know, could not have known, was that 2 weeks before she boarded a train west from South Station, a man in a large office in Dry Creek, Wyoming territory had made a decision about her. Douglas Crane was 52 years old and had been making decisions about things that did not belong to him for 30 of those years. He had come to Wyoming territory in the early 1860s with modest resources and the kind of intelligence that works best when other people underestimate it, and he had built himself into the wealthiest man in Dry Creek County through a combination of patience, timing, and a thorough understanding of which laws could be bent and which men could be bought. His office occupied the corner of the largest building on Dry Creek's main street. The furniture had been brought from Philadelphia, and the rug under his desk had been brought from somewhere farther away than that. On the wall beside the window hung a detailed survey map of Dry Creek Valley, and Crane had spent considerable time over the past 2 years standing in front of that map with a glass of good bourbon and a feeling that was very close to contentment, but not quite there yet. The reason it was not quite there was a parcel of land in the Eastern Valley marked in his private ledger as the Harlow property. In the autumn of 1870, a geologist named Warren Alcott had arrived in Dry Creek on what Crane had described publicly as a mineral survey commission. Alcott had spent 3 weeks moving across the valley with his instruments and his notebooks, and when he departed, he left Crane with a report that contained no significant findings regarding mineral deposits, but included, almost as an afterthought, a notation about the hydrological conditions beneath the eastern section of the valley floor. Crane had read that section 4 times before he understood what it meant. Beneath the Harlow land, at a depth accessible to any competent drilling operation, ran a natural aquifer system of extraordinary size. The kind of underground water reserve that in the arid west of 1870 was worth considerably more than gold if you had the patience to understand why. Water did not merely sustain life on the frontier. Water determined where the railroads went. Where the railroads went determined which towns grew and which withered, which land became valuable, and which stayed cheap. The Union Pacific's planned expansion through Wyoming Territory was not a secret among men who read certain business correspondence carefully. Crane had been reading that correspondence for 3 years. He knew with the quiet certainty of a man who has paid for information that others have not thought to pay for, that a rail spur through Dry Creek Valley was not a rumor. It was a timetable. He had written to Victor Ashford in Philadelphia 18 months ago with Alcott's findings. Ashford's reply had been 4 sentences long and had included between the lines of careful business language an offer that Crane had no intention of refusing. The problem was Ethan Harlow. Crane had approached him twice with purchase offers, once through an intermediary and once directly, and both times had received the same answer delivered in the same quiet voice. The land had belonged to his father and to his father's father, and it was not for sale, not at any price Crane had named, not at prices Crane had hinted he could name. The Harlow brothers had lived on that land for their entire lives. 2 of them had been born on it, and the eldest one had the quality of steadiness that Crane had learned over 30 years to recognize as the most dangerous thing in a man. Not aggression, not pride. Steadiness, the kind that did not bend under pressure because it had already considered the pressure and decided it did not matter. Crane had tried legal challenges to the land title through the county court. The paperwork was clean. He had tried disruptions to their supply arrangements. They adapted. He had tried through Sheriff Wendell Holloway to make their operation difficult in small ways. The Harlow brothers simply worked harder and spoke less and went on. It was Victor Ashford's letter in July of 1872 that had sharpened the situation considerably. Resolve this before winter, Ashford had written. I have made commitments that require clear title to that water access by the first quarter of 1873. Crane sat with that letter for 3 days before the idea came to him. It was elegant in the way, the truly ruthless plans sometimes are, which is to say it used the opponent's own decency against him. He would place an advertisement in a Boston newspaper using Ethan Harlow's name. He would find a woman, a specific kind of woman, one who was alone enough and hopeful enough to travel west in answer to a mail order. Notice one who would not be immediately missed by powerful people. He would correspond with her as Ethan Harlow. He would arrange for her to travel to Wyoming, and then somewhere between the last stagecoach station and Dry Creek, his men would intercept her. They would place her in the Harlow barn. They would place a letter on her person written in a hand carefully copied from documents Crane had obtained through the county clerk's office over the years, a letter that constituted in plain language a confession of abduction. When she was found dead or near enough, the Harlow brothers would be arrested for a crime they could not disprove. The land would be tied up in legal proceedings, title disputed, and Crane's attorney had already prepared the documentation that would allow the county to move toward forced sale during a criminal proceeding. It was the kind of plan that worked because it required the victims to have something to lose. The Harlow brothers had everything to lose, and they had too much decency to have prepared for the absence of it in others. What Crane had not accounted for was that the woman he selected was Grace Whitmore. The last stage stop before Dry Creek stood 8 miles out of town on the road that cut north through the hills, a rough structure of weathered timber that served as a rest point for drivers and an overnight stop when the light ran out. Grace arrived there on the afternoon of the 15th of September, the only passenger remaining on a coach that had been shedding travelers for 3 days since Cheyenne. She had been traveling for 11 days. She was tired in the way of a person who has been sleeping in motion, never quite resting, always half aware of the next stop and the next connection. But she had also been watching for 11 days the land change around her, and the land had done something to her attention that she had not expected. It had expanded it, There was so much of it so open and so indifferent to her presence that she had found herself seeing individual things more clearly than she ever had in the crowded streets of Boston. The particular lean of a cottonwood, the color of rock in a certain afternoon light, the way a hawk held itself motionless in a thermal. She was thinking about this standing beside her trunk in the dust outside the stage stop when the man approached her. He was not large. He had the kind of forgettable face that certain men cultivate deliberately, the kind that slides out of memory almost as soon as it enters. And he wore ranch clothes that were clean enough to have been recently acquired for an occasion rather than broken in by actual work. He introduced himself as a hand from the Harlow Ranch sent ahead to bring her in early because Mr. Harlow had gotten word of a fast-moving weather system from the northwest. Grace looked at him. The first thing she noticed was his eyes, which never settled on her face for more than a second, before moving to something just to the left of her. She had learned this about people who were lying. They could not hold the point of contact because the contact required a commitment to the false thing they were saying. And the false thing was always slightly uncomfortable, even for people practiced at it. The second thing she noticed was the small hesitation when she asked what message Mr. Harlow had sent along with him. A good hired hand carrying a message from his employer would have had something memorized. This man had a bead of empty time where the answer should have been. She made note of both things. She made a third note of her own situation, standing alone in failing light 8 miles from anywhere she knew with her trunk and her traveling dress, in the day getting toward dark with efficient speed. She climbed up onto the small wagon without assistance. She kept her left hand resting on her traveling bag, where the folded knife sat in its leather sheath. They drove north on the road for 2 miles. The light was going amber and long, stretching their shadows out ahead of them across the hard ground. Grace watched the landscape and cataloged it the way she cataloged everything filing the shape of the hill. To the left, the dry creek bed. They crossed the dead cottonwood with its 2 broken upper branches pointing east. She was looking at a red-tailed hawk on a fence post when the wagon slowed and stopped. 2 men came out of the shadow of a dry arroyo to the right. They came without haste, which was worse than if they had come quickly. Quick men are frightened. These men were not. She had the knife out of the bag before the first one reached the wagon, but he was faster than she had anticipated, and the cloth came over her mouth and nose before she could do what Mrs. Flanagan had once told her to do with it. The smell was sharp and sweet and wrong, and the world went sideways. What she heard in the last moment before the darkness took everything was one man's voice saying to another low and without particular emotion, "Put her in the Harlow barn. Make it look right." The cabin of the Harlow Ranch was not large. 3 men had been making do in it for 5 years since Ethan came home from the war and found his brothers managing without the things that made managing bearable. And the main room showed this in the way a working space shows the people who use it. The table was solid and scarred. The chairs were mismatched and repaired. The gun rack above the door held 2 Winchesters and a long Sharps buffalo rifle that had belonged to their father and was kept oiled and clean, the way certain things are kept, not because they will be used, but because the care is itself a kind of remembrance. There was no curtain on the kitchen window. There had been one once years ago, but it had gotten torn and no one had replaced it because the things you notice going missing are the things you are already paying attention to. And 3 men working a ranch together develop certain practical blind spots. Grace Whitmore noticed the missing curtain within 30 seconds of regaining consciousness. She lay still for a moment after awareness returned the way she had been taught, by the simple logic of dangerous situations: assess before you move, and took stock. She was in a real bed with a real mattress and a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn timber, unpainted, with a small, dark knot in the third beam from the window that her eyes went to, automatically because her eyes were still doing the cataloging work, even while the rest of her was determining that her wrists were no longer bound, and her jaw was no longer aching from the cloth gag, and she was by every test she could apply uninjured except for the dried cut above her eye, which announced itself as a dull, stinging pressure. The room was daylit, late morning light she judged by its angle. She had been unconscious for hours. She sat up slowly. The room told her things immediately. One bed, one man's room, everything here the work of practical hands with no decorative instinct and no particular consciousness of absence. A coat on a peg, a pair of boots beneath it, a small shelf with 3 books on it. 2 were army manuals she could read the spines of from where she sat, and one was a Bible. A pistol belt hung on the bedpost holster, and all which meant whoever owned this room had chosen not to be armed when they entered it. She filed this, heavy boots outside the door, a pause, a knock. She said nothing. The door opened inward, and she looked up, and then found his face. He was very tall. She had not known quite what to expect, but she had formed some image as a person will when they have been corresponding with someone, and what she had formed was not this. This was a man who looked like the land he lived on, weathered and permanent, and not much concerned with how it appeared. His hair was dark and going toward gray at the temples, and his face had been shaped by years of outdoor work into something that was not exactly handsome, but was she thought honest in the way that faces occasionally are, the way a face is when a person has stopped trying to make it say anything other than what it means. His eyes were amber-colored. She noticed them because they were looking at her with an expression she had not expected and would have had difficulty naming. Not suspicion, not guilt, something closer to the careful attentiveness of a person who is about to say something they want to get exactly right. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and measured. "My name is Ethan Harlow. I did not write that letter. I need you to know that before anything else." Grace looked at him. She had learned that silence applied correctly told you more than questions. He stood in the doorway with his right hand open at his side and his left hand holding the door frame, and he did not fill the room with words the way a guilty man fills a room with explanations. He said what he had to say, and then he waited. She looked at his hands, the right one open, the left one holding but not gripping. She looked at the holster on the bedpost behind her, the one he had left there rather than wearing into a room with an injured woman he didn't know. She looked at his eyes. "Then who did?" she asked. "That is what I intend to find out." 2 other men appeared behind him in the doorway, and she understood from their faces and their builds that these were the brothers she had been told about, or more accurately, that whoever had written the false letter had known about them and used that knowledge. The one on the left was broader through the shoulders and had a watchfulness in his expression that she read as assessment rather than welcome, studying her the way you study something that might be a problem. The one on the right was younger and had eyes that she would have described if someone asked her later as open, which was the rarest thing in a person, and usually either genuine or very well practiced. She decided to give herself 48 hours. It was not the decision of a woman who trusted blindly. It was the decision of a woman who had been trained by circumstance to collect evidence before drawing conclusions, and who understood that 48 hours in close proximity to 3 people would show her more truth about them than any amount of prior information. She also understood in the practical part of her mind that never entirely stopped working, even when other parts of her were frightened or exhausted, that she was 8 miles from the nearest town. She could name, had no horse, had no direct connection to anyone who could help her, and that the 3 men looking at her from the doorway had thus far given her no reason to add to her problems by making an enemy of them. "Thank you," she said, "for cutting the rope." The one on the right, the younger one, smiled with his whole face in the unguarded way of someone who has not yet learned to portion out his reactions. The one on the left did not change expression, but shifted his weight slightly, which she cataloged as a relaxation. Ethan Harlow said, "There's coffee." She got out of bed. The afternoon brought the sheriff. She had been sitting at the kitchen table for 3 hours by then with coffee and a bowl of beans that she had eaten without pretense because she was genuinely hungry, and she had spent those 3 hours in a kind of accelerated study of the 3 men who came and went from that cabin. She watched how Ethan moved through his own space with a deliberateness that was not slowness, but economy. Each action connected to the next without wasted motion. She watched how Cole, which was the name of the one who had assessed her, interacted with his older brother, the particular shorthand of men who have worked alongside each other for years, communication and gesture and posture more than words. She watched Jamie, the youngest, who had the quality of a person still in the process of becoming himself and finding it interesting rather than alarming. She wrote 3 pages in her journal. Beneath the name Crane, which she had written at the top of the 3rd page in capital letters because it was the name she had heard in the darkness before the drug took her, she wrote a single word, why. That was when the sound of horses came from the road. Cole heard it first. He was at the window before any of them had moved, and what he saw there made the muscle along his jaw go tight in the way Grace had already learned it went tight when something required him to keep himself controlled. She came to stand beside him. 4 riders on the road coming in at a steady pace. The man in front wore a badge. He was 50 or so with a broad red face and the posture of a man who carries authority the way some men carry extra weight present but uncomfortable. Behind him, 3 younger men with rifles resting across their saddles. She went to the door before any of the brothers moved. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said, not a command, more a question. I have this, she said, and stepped out onto the porch. Sheriff Wendell Holloway pulled up his horse 10 feet from the porch steps and looked at the young woman standing there in a navy blue traveling dress with dried blood above her eye, in the stillness of someone who is about to say something that cannot be unsaid. He had his paper out the warrant Crane's attorney had drafted and pushed through the county circuit in less than a day, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of a man who has been handed a tool by someone he doesn't entirely trust and been told it's the right tool for the job. He had his doubts. He was a man who had long since traded his instincts for the practical considerations of keeping his position and providing for the household that included a boy he had raised as his own for 18 years. And he told himself his doubts were a luxury. Ethan Harlow. Cole Harlow, James Harlow, he read from the paper. By order of Dry Creek County Circuit, you are under arrest for the abduction of one Grace Whitmore of Boston, Massachusetts, and for Sheriff. She said it the way a woman who has been educated says a word when she wants it to land at its full weight. He stopped. My name is Grace Whitmore, she said. I am standing in front of you because I am unharmed, which I am because of the 3 men you are here to arrest. I was drugged and bound and placed in that barn by men I did not know and cannot yet fully identify. These men found me and freed me and gave me shelter. They did not do it, and if you proceed with this arrest, I will testify to exactly what I have told you in any court in Wyoming territory, and I will additionally state for the record that the individuals responsible told each other in my hearing that they needed the scene to look as though the Harlow brothers had committed this crime. The horses shifted. One of the younger deputies coughed. The paper in Holloway's hand was very still. Grace stood on that porch with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes steady on Wendell Holloway's face, and she waited. Behind her inside the doorway, Cole Harlow stood with his arms crossed and his jaw locked and every muscle in his body performing the labor of holding itself perfectly still. This was the kind of labor he was not naturally gifted at, and it was costing him something considerable. Ethan stood 2 steps back from the door. Holloway looked at the woman on the porch. He looked at the warrant in his hand. He looked at the Harlow brothers visible behind her in the cabin doorway. He looked back at the warrant. He rolled it up slowly. We'll look into this further, he said. You do that, Grace said. The 4 riders turned and went back down the road toward town, and the sound of their horses faded into the ordinary sounds of the valley. Wind in the dry grass, a meadowlark somewhere to the north. The creak of the porch boards as Grace let out a breath that she had been holding for longer than she realized. Behind her, Jamie said something very quietly that she could not hear. Cole said nothing, but she heard him move the sound of a man sitting down heavily in a chair. The release of tension held too long. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and stood beside her, and they looked together at the road where the sheriff's party had gone. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Whoever planned this will not stop at one failed attempt. He looked at her then with those amber eyes in the afternoon light, and there was something in his expression that had not been there in the morning. Not warmth exactly, something more durable than warmth. The recognition one careful person gives to another. "No," he said, "they won't." That night, the three brothers slept in the barn. No one discussed this arrangement. Ethan brought extra blankets from the chest. Cole checked the latches on the doors and windows of the cabin with the thoroughness of a man who does not intend to be surprised twice. Jamie set a fresh pitcher of water on the table inside and then stood for a moment in the cabin doorway, looking at the woman sitting at the table with her journal open and her pen moving, and the expression on his face was the one he wore when something seemed to him exactly right in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. Outside, Ethan sat on the top rail of the east fence for a time after his brothers had gone inside the barn, looking at the stars over the Wyoming hills. The night was clear and cold, and the kind of dark that only exists far from cities, the kind where the stars are not decoration, but the actual sky pressing down with all its weight and all its distance. He had the false letter in his shirt pocket still. He took it out and looked at it in the starlight, which was not enough to read by, but was enough to see the shape of words on paper, the outline of sentences that had been constructed to destroy 3 lives with the patience and intelligence of someone who understood that the most efficient weapon against a man of honor is a document that appears to prove he has none. Someone had done this. Someone with resources and patience and a reason specific enough to justify the complexity of the plan. Someone who wanted this land or wanted the Harlow brothers gone from it with enough urgency to involve a woman from Boston who had done nothing wrong and known nothing about any of it. He thought about the woman at the table inside, the way she had stood on that porch, the quality of her stillness, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of a person who has decided what they are going to do and is doing it, the steady voice, the eyes that watched everything and gave away only what she chose to give away. He thought about the name she had written in her journal. He had seen it over her shoulder when he passed to put more wood on the fire. Crane in capital letters at the top of the page. She had heard it. In the dark half-conscious, she had heard someone say it, and she had filed it away and written it down the first chance she got. He folded the false letter and put it back. Inside the cabin, Grace Whitmore closed her journal and sat for a moment in the firelight with her hands in her lap. She was thinking about her father in Boston, standing at the kitchen window with the newspaper folded, wrong looking out at the street. She was thinking about the way he had said, "Be careful with that particular note in his voice," the note of a man who is saying something true, but not saying everything true that he knows. She picked up her pen and wrote one more line before she slept. "Father knew something. He let me go anyway." There is a reason for both of those things, and I do not yet know what it is. She closed the journal. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the valley like a hell breath, cold and clear and waiting. And somewhere in Dry Creek, in a corner office with Philadelphia furniture and a map on the wall with one parcel of land stubbornly unmarked, Douglas Crane sat with a lamp burning late and read a message from a man named Victor Ashford that had arrived that afternoon by telegraph from Cheyenne. The message was 4 words: "Coming west. Fix this." The first morning, Grace Whitmore woke in the Harlow cabin. As something other than a patient, she woke before anyone else. This was not unusual for her. She had been an early riser since childhood, since the years when the quiet hours before her father descended the stairs were the hours that belonged entirely to her, and she had learned to use them. She dressed in the gray wool dress she had packed for practical days, laced her boots without sitting on the bed, and went to the window. The valley was still dark at the edges, the hills to the east only beginning to separate themselves from the sky in the thin pre-dawn light. There was frost on the grass near the fence line. The cattle in the near pasture were shapes in the mist, large and slow and unconcerned with the cold. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse knocked against its stall. She stood at that window for a long time and looked at the land she had come west to inhabit, and she let herself see it plain without expectation and without the softening that comes from wanting something to be what you hope for. It was harder than anything she had grown up around. Harder in the literal sense, the ground drier and stonier, than the soft earth of Massachusetts, the distances between things larger, the sky more present pressing down with a weight that was also somehow a kind of freedom. The fences needed work. The kitchen garden at the back of the cabin had been left to its own management for too long, the rows gone ragged, the soil compacted and thin. The cabin itself was sound but spare, in the way that a structure is spare when the people inside it have been attending to survival rather than comfort. She put on her coat and went outside. The cold hit her with the authority of mountain air, clean and direct, without the harbor smell she had grown up breathing. She stood on the porch for a moment, getting accustomed to it, and then she walked around to the kitchen garden and crouched in the dirt and looked at what was there. Tomatoes past their best sagging on their stakes. Beets, which were forgiving. Some kind of squash that had done well despite the neglect. She pressed her fingers into the soil between the rows. It was better than it looked. There was something in its structure depth. Someone, the brother's mother, she imagined, had built this soil properly once, and it still remembered. She was calculating what it would take to restore the beds for the spring planting when she heard boots on the porch. Jamie came around the corner of the cabin, with his hair still bearing the engineering of a man who had slept without caring which way his head fell. He stopped when he saw her. "You're up," he said. "So are you." He looked at the garden and then back at her. "I keep meaning to do something about that." "What stops you?" "Not knowing enough about gardens," he said. "And Cole says it's not the priority in autumn." "Cole is right about the autumn part," she said. "But the soil needs turning before the ground freezes, or you'll lose what structure is left." Jamie looked at the garden with the expression of a man receiving information he was not sure what to do with. Then he looked at her with something approaching relief. "Do you want to show me what you mean?" She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. They worked together for an hour before the sun was fully up, turning the beds with a fork she found in the small shed beside the garden, Grace directing and Jamie working, and in that hour she learned more about Jamie Harlow than any amount of formal conversation would have provided. He asked questions without embarrassment when he did not know something. He listened to the answers with the same full attention he gave to everything, as if the information actually mattered, rather than simply requiring acknowledgement. He had a quiet humor that announced itself sideways in observations that arrived slightly after the moment they referenced, so that she was often still considering one remark when the next one came. He told her about the dappled, gray horse he had been working with for 3 weeks. Since it had come up lame, the tenderness it still showed at the left foreleg, the way it had begun to trust him by small degrees. He described this with more detail than he probably intended and more feeling than he was aware of showing. "He doesn't trust people easy," Jamie said about the horse. "Most things worth trusting don't," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I suppose that's true." By the time Ethan and Cole appeared from the barn, there was coffee on the stove, and the kitchen garden had been turned, and the morning had a quality she had not anticipated. Something that felt almost ordinary, which was strange and not unwelcome. Cole Harlow ate breakfast without offering conversation, which she had already identified as his neutral state rather than a judgment about her. He was a man who spent his words deliberately, and the fact that he directed several of them at Ethan regarding the fence repairs he had assessed from the barn door told her more than silence would have. He was not being unwelcoming. He was simply being Cole, which meant he was watching everything and saying less than he saw. Ethan ate with the focused efficiency of a man who eats because the body requires it, and breakfast is not a social event. He drank his coffee black and standing looking out the window at the same valley she had looked at before dawn. She caught him doing this twice. Both times he turned back to the room with the same measured expression, as if whatever he was thinking about the view was information he was storing rather than sharing. What she noticed in the accumulated evidence of that first full day was this. These 3 men had built their life here together with the self-sufficiency of people who have had no alternative. And in doing so, they had also built a set of habits and assumptions and ways of being that had no space in them for another person. Not because they had deliberately excluded that space, simply because no one had ever stood in it before. She was standing in it now. She intended to make herself useful, not because she needed to justify her presence, but because usefulness was how she had always moved through the world, and because a working ranch in September had no patience for ornament. By the end of that first full day, she had reorganized the pantry, identified which supplies were running low before winter, mended a shirt that had been left on the mending pile long enough to gather dust on both sleeves, and had a second longer conversation with Cole Harlow about the kitchen garden, which he concluded by saying with the flatness that served him as a compliment that the spring beds would be better for the work. That evening she made biscuits from flour and lard, in the memory of Mrs. Flanagan's hands shaping dough in the kitchen off Hanover Street, and served them with the leftover beans from lunch, and the three brothers ate them without comment. But Jamie ate 4 and Cole ate 3, and Ethan, who she was beginning to understand, looked at his empty plate with the expression of a man who has registered something good. She wrote in her journal that night, "They are not what I expected. They are something I do not yet have a word for. But I think I am going to need one." Martha Jenkins ran the general store on the east side of Dry Creek's Main Street, a position she had held for 11 years since her husband Abraham had died of a chest ailment in the winter of 1861, and left her with the store mortgage and the clarity of vision that comes to certain women when they are forced to manage entirely on their own and discover they are better at it than anyone, including themselves, had previously suspected. She was 55 years old and knew the business of every family in Dry Creek County in the way that only a person who sells everyone their flour and their lamp oil and their boot nails ever truly knows a community from the inside out. She had an opinion about most things she knew and kept the majority of those opinions to herself, which made the ones she chose to share carry considerable weight. Grace met her on the 4th day when she rode into town with Jamie on a supply run. Martha Jenkins looked at her across the counter with the frank assessment of a woman who has been around long enough to sort people quickly, and then she said, "You're the girl from Boston." "Yes," Grace said. "Somebody put you in that barn." "Yes." Martha Jenkins set down the account book she had been writing in. "What are you going to do about it?" Grace looked at her. "Find out who sent me here and why." Martha Jenkins nodded, once the nod of a person who has received an acceptable answer. "Then you'll need coffee and information." "I have both." The information took 3 visits over the course of a week, each one layering detail onto the previous. The way you build a picture of something by walking around it from different angles. What Martha knew about Douglas Crane was not the information that was publicly available in Dry Creek, the story of a successful man who had built himself a position through hard work and good judgment. What she knew was the information that existed in the gaps of that story, the places where the official account did not quite account for what had actually happened. She described 3 neighboring ranchers who had sold their land to Crane within the previous 4 years. In each case, the sale had come after a period of unusual difficulty for the seller. 2 had experienced significant unexplained losses in their herd's animals, sickening and dying in ways that the local veterinarian had not been able to fully explain. The 3rd had found himself involved in a legal dispute over his water rights that had drained his resources over 18 months before he accepted Crane's offer. "He buys low," Martha said, after making it expensive to say no. "Has anyone reported this to anyone?" "Wendell Holloway is the only law in this county," Martha said with the dryness of someone describing a structural problem they have lived with long enough to have lost their outrage about it. "What about the federal circuit?" Martha looked at her with something that shifted toward interest. "You'd need evidence that met a federal standard, not just the word of people who can't prove what they believe." Grace thought about this on the ride back to the ranch, with the Wyoming hills orange and red around her in the late October light, and Jamie riding beside her and asking her what she was thinking about. She told him she was thinking about what evidence looks like when it is built to be invisible. He was quiet for a moment. "Ethan says that kind of thing is always visible from the right angle. You just have to find the angle." She looked at him. "Does he?" "He doesn't say a lot," Jamie allowed, "but what he says tends to be right." The floor of the old barn had been laid with rough-cut planks over packed earth, and in the northwest corner, where the straw had piled thickest from years of bedding changes, 3 of those planks had settled unevenly with age. Jamie found it on a Tuesday in the second week of October. He had been working on the barn floor for 3 days, replacing rotted boards and releveling what had shifted, and the northwest corner had been the last section because it required moving a decade of accumulated straw and the chest that someone had shoved against the wall at some point in the past, and no one had moved since. When he pulled up the loose board in the corner, he found packed earth beneath it that was different from the earth around it, not in composition, but in character. It had been disturbed and repacked, within the last few years at most. He called Ethan, who brought a short-handled spade, and what they found 8 inches down was a metal box about the size of a large book sealed with a latch that had been pressed shut and left for what the rust on its hinge suggested was somewhere between 2 and 4 years. They brought it to the table in the cabin. Grace was the one who opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several sheets of paper. The top sheet was a formal document with a printed letterhead at the top, the kind that came from an office with money for good paper. And at the center of that letterhead, printed in small, precise type, was a circular device, a circle, the letter A inside it, 2 vertical lines through the circle parallel like rails, Ashford Western Land Trust, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Beneath the letterhead, in the language of technical surveying that she had to read slowly to follow, was a report dated October 1870. The author was a W. Alcott, described in the document as a consulting geologist retained by the trust. The report described the results of a hydrological survey conducted in Dry Creek Valley, Wyoming Territory in September and October of 1870. She read it once quickly and understood the shape of what it said. She read it again slowly and understood the details. She looked up at Ethan, who was standing across the table from her. "There is water under this land," she said. "Underground, a large natural system, more water than anything else within 50 miles according to this." Cole was at the window. He turned around. "Under our land?" Ethan said. Not a question. "Under the eastern section, the piece you haven't cultivated." She held up the second page, which was a map. The survey lines ran across a drawing of the valley that she recognized from the shape of the hills and the creek line, and the hatched markings indicating the underground water source sat entirely within the boundaries of the parcel labeled Harlow in the surveyor's hand. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when information of significant weight has just been set in the middle of them. Jamie said from the doorway, "How much is that worth?" "Not water by itself," Grace said. She looked at the document in her hands. She was thinking. "But the Union Pacific is expanding its line through Wyoming Territory. I read about it in the Chicago papers on the way west. A rail line needs water at regular intervals for the steam engines. Whoever controls the water source controls where the line goes, and whoever controls where the line goes controls which land becomes valuable and which stays cheap." She set the paper down. "This isn't about a ranch." "No," Ethan said quietly. "This is about a railroad." Cole said a word that was not appropriate for polite company, and then looked briefly at Grace with the expression of a man remembering that polite company was present. She did not acknowledge this. She was still looking at the document. "This was buried here," she said. "Someone hid this. Someone who didn't want Crane to have it." "The previous owner," Ethan said. "A man named Alcott sold my father this property in 1868. He kept the eastern section in the arrangement longer than the rest, deeded it separately in 1869. I never knew why." "I think you do now," she said. She studied the letterhead, the circle, the A, the 2 parallel lines. The symbol sat in her memory like something seen before and almost forgotten, the way a word sits on the tip of the tongue. She turned it in her mind the way you turn a key looking for the lock it fits. She found it at 2 in the morning, sitting with the lamp burning low and her journal open on the table. The letters from Philadelphia, the ones her father had slid under his ledger when she walked into the room, the ones sealed with a pressed wax disc that she had seen twice on his desk before he moved them. The wax had been a dark red, and the impression in it had been she was now certain the same circle with its letter and its parallel lines. She wrote it in her journal. She wrote it slowly and without haste, the way she had learned to write the things she needed to look at clearly. Her father owed money to Ashford Western Land Trust. The trust had used him. How much they had used him, what he knew, and what he had been made to do with what he knew she could not yet say. But the letter that had drawn her to Wyoming, the letter signed in Ethan Harlow's name, had reached her through a Boston newspaper. Someone had placed it there knowing she would see it. Someone who knew she read the Chronicle. Someone who knew she was the kind of woman who might answer such an advertisement. Someone who knew Thomas Whitmore's household from the inside. She sat with this for a long time. Then she got up and went to Ethan's door and knocked. He answered within seconds, which told her he had not been sleeping. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Come in," and he said. He moved to the chair at the table and she sat across from him, and she told him what she had worked out plain and in order without softening any part of it. He listened with the complete stillness that she was coming to understand as one of his characteristic qualities, the absolute presence of a person who gives their full attention as a matter of commitment rather than courtesy. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father," he said, "do you think he knew what they were going to do with the information they got from him?" "I think he knew something was wrong," she said. "I don't know how much, but he warned me at the station, in his way." "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at the table between them and then at her. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you came out here for this." She met his eyes. "I came out here for something honest," she said. "I may have found it despite the dishonest means." The silence between them was not the silence of strangers who have run out of words. It was the other kind, and she was aware of this in a way she was not entirely comfortable with. Not because it frightened her, but because she was a careful woman and she was not ready to be careless about anything yet. She said goodnight. She went to bed and lay awake for a time, and then slept, and the Wyoming stars outside the window did not care either way. The following afternoon, she went with Jamie to the telegraph office in Dry Creek. She had composed the message to an old family friend in Boston, a solicitor named Edgarton, who had known her father for 30 years and could be trusted with an inquiry sent from a distance. She kept it short. She asked what he knew of Ashford Western Land Trust and its principles. She paid for the message and turned to find Jamie already in conversation with Amos Pratt. Amos was 12 years old, the son of Hector Pratt, who ran the smithy on the south end of Main Street, and he was the kind of child who had discovered early that being small and unremarkable in appearance was an advantage in a town where adults rarely finished their private conversations before sending him on to the next errand. He had been carrying messages, filling water barrels, sweeping porches, and mending harness leather since he was 8, and in 4 years of this work, he had heard most of what there was to hear in Dry Creek, without anyone ever pausing to consider what a boy of 12 did with what he listened to. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, and sharp eyes that moved faster than most adults gave him credit for, and a quick assessing look that reminded Grace of herself at that age, which was not a quality she had expected to find in a child in Wyoming territory. Jamie introduced them with the ease of two people who have known each other since the boy was 6. Amos looked at Grace with the direct appraisal of a person who has no reason to be tactful. "You're the one from Boston," he said. "I seem to be known for that," she said. "I heard you made the sheriff take back his warrant," he said. "I persuaded him to reconsider." Amos nodded, appearing to find this satisfactory. Then he said in a different tone, lower and more deliberate, the tone of a person who has information they have been waiting for the appropriate moment to deploy. "Mr. Crane has men coming from out of county. I heard him say so to Mr. Holloway's deputy, the younger one in the feed store yesterday. He said to have them ready by end of the week." Grace looked at him carefully. "You heard this," she said. "I was sweeping the back of the feed store," Amos said, with the mild dignity of a person whose methodology does not require defense. She looked at Jamie. Jamie looked at her. They rode back to the ranch at a pace that was faster than they had ridden into town. Deputy Ray Holloway was 26 years old and had his mother's dark coloring, and his actual father's jaw, which was Douglas Crane's jaw, a fact that was visible to anyone who looked at the two of them side by side and knew enough to look. Most people in Dry Creek did not look. It was one of the many things that people in a small town sometimes collectively decide not to see because seeing it creates obligations no one has volunteered for. Reverend Cornelius Hale had been in Dry Creek since before it had its name, and he had performed the baptisms of many children in the county over 30 years. And he knew which ones he had performed and which ones he had not. He was not a man who spoke carelessly about private matters, but he was also in the way of old clergymen who have watched more than they have been credited with watching, not entirely able to conceal the weight of what he knew when someone asked him the right question in the right way. Grace asked him the right question on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting across the small table in the church's front room with a cup of tea that was mostly hot water. And what Reverend Hale told her in the careful language of a man who was not technically saying what he was actually saying was that Wendell Holloway had a son who had not come to the Holloway house through the ordinary means, and that the timing of the boy's arrival in that household and the timing of certain arrangements between Crane and the sheriff's office were not in his long observation unrelated. She thanked him for the tea. She rode back through the October afternoon and arrived at the ranch to find Ethan and Cole at the kitchen table with a man named Henderson, who ran cattle on the west side of the valley and had the look of a person who has been recently persuaded of something he was already inclined to believe. She stood in the doorway and let them finish. What Cole had done, she learned later in the week since she had arrived, and the world had begun to clarify itself, was ride to 3 neighboring properties and have the kind of direct conversations that Cole Harlow was particularly suited to have, conversations that stripped away the polite fictions that had allowed decent people to keep their distance from a problem that they understood was getting worse. He was not a man who made things comfortable. He was a man who made things clear, and in circumstances where clarity was what was needed, this was the more useful quality. Henderson would speak to Walsh. Walsh would speak to the Patterson brothers. There were 7 families in the valley who had watched Crane's operation expand with a combination of resentment and helplessness that comes from having no evidence sufficient for action and no mechanism for action, even if you had the evidence. Cole had offered them both. That evening, after Henderson had gone, Grace sat at the table with all 3 brothers and laid out what she knew about Ray Holloway. Cole was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then the muscle in his jaw moved and he said, "That is how he always knows." "Yes," she said. "Every complaint we ever sent to the county circuit," Cole said. "Every time we went to Holloway. Every time. Yes." Ethan said nothing. He was looking at the map that Grace had brought from the barn box and spread on the table between them, the geological survey with its hatched markings and its truss letterhead. He traced the boundary line of their eastern section with one finger, not touching the paper itself, but moving a 1/4 inch above it, as if feeling the edges of something that had been there all along without anyone knowing what to call it. The fire needed more wood, and Grace got up to add it without asking if it needed adding, because it did. And because she was living here now in the way that you live in a place when you have decided it is yours, not by conquest, but by the decision to tend it. She thought she heard, but was not certain, one of the brothers say something very quietly to the others. The words might have been, "We'll keep her safe," or they might have been something else entirely. She chose not to turn around. She added the wood. She stood at the fire for a moment, feeling its heat. That night came cold and clear and full of stars, and at 3 in the morning, something woke Cole Harlow from a sleep he had been holding at a shallow angle for hours without entirely knowing why. He was at the window before the sound fully formed in his awareness, and by the time his eyes had adjusted to the dark outside, he already knew what the shadow movement at the far edge of the yard was, and what direction it was coming from, and how many there were. 4 of them, coming from the south tree line on foot, each one carrying something low at his side that caught the faint moonlight in the specific way that a glass bottle with oil-soaked cloth in its neck catches light. Cole was out the barn door and on the roof before any of the others were fully awake. He heard Ethan coming out of the cabin door below him, and he said quietly but carrying 4 South Tree Line torches. What happened in the next 10 minutes was the kind of thing that is over before anyone has fully formed a memory of it, because the body handles it before the mind has time to organize what is happening into a narrative. Cole from the rooftop reading the yard the way he had read it for 20 years and knew every angle of. Ethan moving across the open space with the economy of a soldier who has learned to use darkness as cover rather than obstacle. The first torch hit the hay pile near the south fence and caught with a sound like a dry intake of breath. And then Ethan was there with a blanket, and Jamie was there with the water barrel he had somehow already located in the dark. And Cole's rifle said once from the rooftop, once more not aiming to kill but to stop. And the 4 men on foot scattered back toward the tree line with the urgency of people who had expected less resistance than they found. One of them dropped something as he ran. Grace picked it up in the confusion and put it in her coat pocket without looking at it because the fire still needed dealing with. And there were more important things than whatever it was she had stepped on in the dark. The fire was out within 20 minutes. The hay pile had lost perhaps a third of what was in it. No one was seriously hurt. Cole had a splinter in his palm from the roof planking. Ethan's shoulder, the left one, had taken the impact of a fall against the fence rail and was carrying a bruise that he did not mention until 2 days later when it showed above his collar. When it was over and the 4 men were gone back into whatever dark they had come from, and the ranch was quiet again in the loaded quiet of a place where a threat has passed but not resolved, Grace stood near the scorched fence line and opened her hand to look at what she had picked up in the dark. A brass coat button, small, decorative rather than practical, engraved with a pattern she recognized after a moment of study as the kind of custom work that was done in shops in large eastern cities for clients who ordered their clothing bespoke. She held it up in the moonlight. On its face in the center of the engraved flourish were the initials of a manufacturing firm she had seen represented in the better tailoring establishments of Boston, Arnold and Sons, Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. She looked at the button for a long time. Then she turned to Ethan, who was standing 3 feet away, brushing char from his coat. "Where is the nearest telegraph office that is not in Dry Creek?" He looked at her, then at the button in her hand. 40 miles east, Pembroke Station. Why? Because I have a message I need to send that cannot go through the Dry Creek office, she said, and I need it to go tonight or as close to tonight as we can manage. He looked at the button again. Philadelphia, she said. He sent Cole with her at first light, the 2 of them riding the 40 miles east in the cold with the hills turning from black to gray to the pale gold of a late October morning. And she thought about the button in her coat pocket and the letterhead in the barn box, and the man in Boston who had slid his Philadelphia correspondence under his ledger when his daughter came into the room and the shape that all of it was beginning to make. She thought about what Reverend Haley had said in his careful, indirect way about Ray Holloway, and the question of which loyalties bind and which ones break. She thought about Ethan standing in the yard in the cold before dawn, looking at the scorched fence rail with the expression of a man adding things to a column that is getting long. She thought about what it meant that someone had sent men from Philadelphia wearing Philadelphia tailor's buttons to burn a hay pile on a Wyoming ranch in October, and what it said about the distance between the problem they were in and the nearest authority with the power to do anything about it. The telegraph office at Pembroke Station was run by a man of 60 with a green shade on his lamp and no interest in the content of the messages he sent, which was the precise quality Grace required. She wrote out 2 messages at the small desk he provided and paid for both. The first went to her contact in Boston. The second went to a name and address in Cheyenne that she had memorized from the back page of the Colorado law directory she had read on the train coming west, the name of the federal circuit judge whose jurisdiction covered Wyoming territory. She did not tell Cole everything she had written. He did not ask. They rode back the 40 miles in the same companionable silence they had ridden out in, and halfway home, Cole said without particular inflection, "You're not what I thought you were going to be." She looked at him. "What did you think I was going to be?" He was quiet for a moment. Someone who needed things done for her. And now, He looked at the road ahead. Someone who gets things done. She filed this in the category of high compliments from Cole Harlow and did not respond because she had already learned that responding to Cole's compliments caused them to retreat. The reply from the solicitor Egerton came 6 days later, relayed through Pembroke Station and carried to the ranch by Amos Pratt, who had taken on the role of courier between the ranch and the town's more trustworthy residents with the businesslike efficiency of a boy who has found his appropriate calling. Egerton's message was careful and British in its indirection, and told her reading between its lines that Ashford Western Land Trust was known in certain legal circles in Boston and Philadelphia as an organization that specialized in acquiring Western land assets in advance of rail development, that Victor Ashford was its principal, and that there were questions in several quarters about the methods by which some of those acquisitions had been facilitated. Nothing criminal on the record. Considerable that was suggestive of it. She showed it to Ethan. He read it twice. He set it on the table. He looked out the window at the eastern section of the ranch, visible from the kitchen, the unworked ground that sat above the water that had changed everything without anyone knowing it was there. Victor Ashford is coming here, she said. The telegraph crane received. Fix this. That's Ashford. Yes. When he arrives, this stops being a local problem. She leaned her hands on the table. A federal judge's jurisdiction, a fraudulent contract with the railroad, documented evidence of a planned abduction. These are federal matters. What Crane has been doing in this county is serious, but it is small against what Ashford has done. The trust has committed securities fraud against Union Pacific, a federal railway. That is not something a county attorney can make disappear. Ethan was still looking out the window. She could not see his face clearly from where she stood, only the line of his shoulders and the way he held his left arm when the old wound was bothering him slightly out from his body, giving it space. The problem, she said, is that Ashford's arrival means the timeline compresses. Crane will want this resolved before Ashford sees how badly it has failed. Which means more men, Ethan said. Sooner. Yes. He turned from the window. What he said then was the thing she had been considering how to ask for and had not yet found the words for, and he said it in the same quiet voice. He said everything in the voice that had learned sometime in the years since Virginia that the weight of a thing had nothing to do with how loudly it was delivered. Henderson and Walsh will stand with us if we ask them. The Patterson boys, old McCready from the North End, they've been watching Crane for years and they've got grievances of their own. He paused. But what we need isn't just men with rifles. What we need is someone who can stand in front of this town and say what needs saying in a way that can't be denied. She met his eyes. I can do that, she said. He looked at her for a moment that had more in it than either of them was prepared to say aloud. Then he nodded. I know, he said. That is why I'm asking. He went outside after that, and she stood at the table with the Egerton letter and the geological survey and the brass button from Philadelphia laid out in a row in front of her. And she thought about her father in Boston and about the distance between them and about the things that move across distance without diminishing. Then she picked up her pen and began writing the letter to the Federal Circuit in Cheyenne. It was 4 days before the response came that told her the circuit court had received her documentation and that a federal inquiry had been opened into Ashford Western Land Trust activities in Wyoming Territory. 4 days during which the ranch worked, as it always worked, with the rhythm of a place that operates according to the seasons and the light, regardless of what is happening at its edges. Cole rode out to speak with Henderson and Walsh and came back with the news that both families would be present when needed. Ethan repaired the north fence post that Jamie had been thinking about the week he found Grace in the barn, which felt now like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a month. Jamie continued his patient work with the gray horse, who had begun to put weight on the injured leg, without favoring it, and reported this progress to Grace one morning with the satisfaction of a man whose faith in a slow process has been vindicated. She had started teaching him to read better in the evenings. Not that he was unable, but he was slower than he wanted to be, and there were books on the shelf in Ethan's room that he had been meaning to get to for 2 years. She brought them to the table after supper, and they worked through them together, And Cole watched this from across the room with the expression of a man who has decided to find something ordinary that is clearly not entirely ordinary to him. On the fifth night, Amos Pratt arrived at the ranch on a borrowed horse at a speed that told her the news was urgent before she heard what it was. He pulled up in the yard and Ethan was already at the door. Amos caught his breath. He was 12 years old and he had ridden 3 miles in the dark, and he was not going to let that show more than necessary. Crane has 30 men, he said. Maybe more. They've been gathering since yesterday, and there's a coach come in from the east this afternoon. The kind with a painted door came straight to Crane's office. He paused. 2 men with it, not local. Grace was in the doorway behind Ethan. She knew without needing to ask about the coach what it meant. Ashford had arrived. Cole was already pulling on his coat. Ethan stepped back inside, and the 4 of them stood around the kitchen table in the lamplight, and the lamp threw their shadows large against the walls, the way shadows go large when the light is low. And Grace looked at the 3 brothers, and they looked at her, and the thing between them which had been building through a month of shared days and shared work and shared danger was present in the room as fully as any of them were. We need more people, and we need them before morning, Cole said. I'll ride to Henderson, Jamie said. He was already moving. Walsh and Patterson, Cole said. I'll go. Send Amos to Reverend Hale, Grace said. The church. If this is going to be a public accounting, it needs a public space that no one can object to. They all looked at her. Tomorrow morning, she said, before Crane can organize, before Ashford can understand how much has already been built against him. She looked at Ethan. If I stand in front of this town with what we have, it stops being the Harlow brothers' problem. It becomes something the whole valley has to answer. Ethan was quiet. The fire was burning low, and neither of them moved to add wood. We'll need the documents, he said. I have them. He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, and in his expression was something that she recognized because she had seen it before in the faces of people who have stopped deciding whether to trust and simply begun. Built this with our own hands, he said quietly, and she understood he was not talking about the papers or the plan or the morning. He was talking about all of it, the month of it, the every part of it. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and deep and entirely silent, and in the distance, somewhere on the road between Dry Creek and the ranch, 2 brothers were riding hard toward neighbors who were ready to be asked. The lamp burned low on the table between them, and neither of them spoke, and the documents lay spread between their hands, and the morning was 4 hours away. When Cole left and Jamie left, and Amos Pratt took off on his borrowed horse toward the church, Ethan went to the door and stood looking out at the dark yard and the dark hills beyond it. And Grace stood at the table and looked at the back of him, the set of his shoulders, and the stillness. That was not emptiness, but the opposite of emptiness, a man holding a great deal very quietly. She said, winter always ends. She had heard Jamie say it to the injured horse weeks ago in the barn, and she had written it in her journal and known it was the kind of thing that outlasts the moment it is set in. Ethan turned from the door. He looked at her. It does, he said. He went to add wood to the fire, and she began putting the documents in order for the morning. The night settled in around the cabin, cold and full of stars, and tomorrow was already coming. The coach arrived in Dry Creek on a Thursday morning, and it was not the kind of coach that passed through towns like Dry Creek without people noticing. It was black lacquered to a shine that had no business surviving the roads between Cheyenne and the valley, with a device painted on its door panel in dark gold that Amos Pratt described to Grace that afternoon, with the precision of a boy who understood that details were the currency of his particular usefulness. A circle, a letter in its center, 2 lines through it parallel and deliberate, like something laid across a map to show you where the important thing was. She already knew what it meant. She had known since the barn box and the survey report and the long night of putting the pieces together in the order they actually went. But seeing it described in Amos's careful words, hearing that it had rolled down Main Street and stopped in front of Douglas Crane's building at 10 in the morning, while the town went about its business around it, made it real in the way that things only become real when they arrive in the physical world and occupy space in it. Victor Ashford was in Dry Creek. The two men who had ridden alongside the coach, Amos said, were not the kind of men who carried luggage. They had the look and the posture of men who carried other things and wore their coats cut to accommodate this. Grace listened. She thanked him. She sent him back toward town with a message for Martha Jenkins that said only tomorrow morning before the church opens. Then she went to find Ethan. He was at the north fence, the one he had finally got to replacing, after weeks of it, sitting on the list behind more urgent things. He was working alone, setting posts with the methodical focus he brought to physical labor, each stroke of the mallet even and complete. His hat was pushed back and his coat was open despite the cold. He heard her coming and did not stop working until she was close enough for a normal conversation. She told him what Amos had reported. He set the mallet down against the new post. He stood for a moment looking out across the pasture where the cattle were moving slowly through the frost-brown grass. "How long do we have before he understands how much has changed?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Hours," she said. "Crane will brief him tonight. By tomorrow morning he will know about the federal inquiry, or he will have guessed it. Either way, his calculation changes." "Then tomorrow morning cannot wait," Ethan said. "No," she said, "it cannot." He picked up the mallet. He set one more post, drove it to depth with 4 clean strokes, and then he picked up his coat from the fence rail where he had laid it and walked back toward the cabin with her. And between the fence line and the porch, neither of them spoke because there was nothing that needed to be said to fill the space. The letter came that evening. It arrived through Pembroke Station, relayed by a circuit of hands that Thomas Whitmore had put in place with the patient desperation of a man trying to get a message to his daughter past the people who were watching his correspondence. The final carrier was a freight driver who occasionally stopped at the Harlow Ranch for water and who had been given $3 and the address by someone he had met in Cheyenne 2 days prior. He handed it to Grace at the cabin door and was back on his wagon before she had finished reading the address written on the outside in her father's careful hand. She sat at the table to open it. Inside were 3 pages. The first 2 were in her father's writing, and she read them the way she read things she needed to understand, completely slowly and without skipping anything, even the parts that were difficult. Thomas Whitmore wrote plainly. He had stopped performing optimism somewhere in the previous months, and what was left was the plain substance of a man who has nothing left to protect except the truth. He told her what he had done. He told her the shape of the debt and how it had grown and how Ashford had found it and what he had offered in exchange for the information Ashford needed. He told her that he had not understood at the time what his information would be used for. He told her that he had understood by the time it was too late to stop it, and that this was the thing he would carry longest. He told her that when Ethan Harlow's name entered the arrangement, when Ashford's man had used Thomas Whitmore's knowledge of his daughter's habits and her newspaper and her situation to construct the false advertisement, he had understood that the debt had become something he could not repay by ordinary means. He had started looking for another way. The 3rd page was not in his handwriting. It was a photographic copy, the kind made by a process that required careful light and careful chemistry of a document he had seen once in Ashford's Philadelphia office during a meeting. He should not have been present for that. He had memorized in its essential parts and reconstructed afterward with the help of the same solicitor, Edgerton, whose name Grace had used for her earlier inquiry. It was a contract between Ashford Western Land Trust and the Union Pacific Railroad Company, dated November 1871. Its subject was a series of water rights in Dry Creek Valley, Wyoming Territory, described in the same hydrological language as the survey report from the barn box covering the same underground system beneath the same parcel of eastern land. The trust was warranting clear title to these water rights as collateral for a significant investment arrangement with the railroad. The trust was representing that it held legal ownership of the relevant land. In November 1871, the land in question had belonged to the Harlow family, as it did now, as it had for 20 years before that. Ashford had sold what was not his to sell, not to a county buyer, not in a small arrangement that a local court might manage. He had sold it, falsely represented it to the Union Pacific Railroad Company in a contractual arrangement that carried the full weight of federal commercial law. Grace read the third page 3 times. Then she looked up from the table. Ethan was standing in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, watching her face. He had learned in the weeks since she had come to this place to read her the way you read difficult country, by the small signs rather than the obvious ones. "What is it?" he said. She smoothed the third page on the table between them. "He defrauded the railroad," she said. "Ashford, not just the land arrangement here. He filed a contractual warranty with Union Pacific that claimed legal title to your water rights. He pledged them as collateral for a financial arrangement worth considerably more than this ranch or this valley or anything in it." She looked at him. "This is not a county matter. This is not even a territorial matter. This is federal securities fraud against a federally chartered railroad company, the kind that a federal court has jurisdiction over regardless of what any local authority says or does or looks away from." The fire was low. Neither of them moved to add wood. "My father copied this," she said. "He got it to me." "Your father," Ethan said quietly. "He knew what he was part of," she said. "He tried to undo it the only way he had left." She thought about him standing at the kitchen window with the newspaper folded wrong. She thought about, "Be careful, Grace. Trust what your eyes show you." She thought about the courage of doing the right thing when you have already done the wrong one, and there is no way to do it that does not cost you something. "He's going to be all right," she said, and it was as much a decision as an assessment. Ethan looked at the document. He looked at her. He said, "That is the angle." She nodded. "That is the angle." Reverend Cornelius Hale opened the church at dawn the following morning without any particular expression on his weathered face, which was the expression of a man who had been in this valley long enough to have developed an equanimity about most things that were not contrary to his principal commitments. Allowing the open ground in front of the church to be used for a public accounting was not contrary to any of his principal commitments. If anything, it was aligned with several of them. He stood at the church door and watched the valley come to life around him. The cold morning light coming blue and then gold over the eastern hills, and the first of the families arriving from the north and west roads, Henderson with his wife and his 2 grown sons. Walsh on a black horse with the Patterson brothers flanking him, old McCready from the north end of the valley, who rarely came to town for anything, but had come for this because Cole Harlow had ridden to his property 2 days ago and said what needed saying in the way Cole said things, which left little room for comfortable inaction. Martha Jenkins arrived early before the ranching families and set herself up near the church steps with the air of a woman who has been waiting for this particular morning for several years and intends to be present for all of it. Amos Pratt was there before anyone, having come from town in the dark before most people were awake, and he stood near the fence post at the edge of the church ground with his sharp eyes going between the road from town and the road from the ranch with the professional attentiveness of a person monitoring 2 conversations at once. Crane's men began arriving from the town inn at 7:15. There were 7 of them visible, which meant they were more positioned elsewhere, and they arranged themselves along the street side of the open ground with the studied casualness of men who have been told to appear informal and are not skilled at it. Crane himself came at 7:30 on a bay horse in his good coat with the Philadelphia buttons and took up a position at the corner of the church ground where the angles gave him clear sight lines to the road and the church door and the crowd that was gathering. Wendell Holloway arrived at 7:40 with Ray Holloway at his left side and stood near the water trough on the north side of the road with the expression of a man who is trying to determine in real time which side of a situation is the side that leads to a life he recognizes. Victor Ashford was not present. Grace understood this. Ashford was a man who did not appear at events whose outcome he had not already determined. He would be in Crane's office or in the room at the boarding house that Crane had arranged for him, waiting for a report that confirmed the situation had been managed. He had spent 40 years not being present at the difficult parts while remaining thoroughly accountable for all of them. The documents were in the leather case she had borrowed from the shelf in Ethan's room, and she carried it in her left hand as she came down from the wagon that Jamie had driven to the church ground, Cole beside him on the seat, Ethan on horseback to her right. Henderson and Walsh and the Patterson brothers had positioned themselves across the open ground from Crane's men with the deliberate spacing of people who understood the geometry of the situation without needing to discuss it. She walked to the church steps. She stood at the top of them and looked out at the people gathered in the cold morning light, the ranching families and their wives, and the few townspeople who had come. Martha Jenkins with her capable hands folded at her waist, Amos Pratt at the fence post, Wendell Holloway by the water trough with his red face going a shade redder in the cold. She did not look at Douglas Crane. Not yet. She opened the leather case. "My name is Grace Whitmore," she said, her voice carried in the cold air without effort. "I came to Dry Creek Valley 6 weeks ago in answer to an advertisement placed in the Boston Morning Chronicle. I believe the advertisement had been placed by Ethan Harlow of this county. I came west because I believed there was an honest offer of an honest life available to a woman willing to work for it." The ground was very quiet. I arrived in the last light of a September afternoon at the stage stop 8 miles south of this town. I was met by a man who identified himself as an employee of the Harlow Ranch. He was not. He was employed by Douglas Crane. She paused to let this settle. "I was drugged. I was bound. I was placed in the Harlow barn with a letter on my person that had been written to appear to be a confession by Ethan Harlow of the crime being committed against me." A sound moved through the crowd, not a word, a breath collective and involuntary. "I was found by the Harlow brothers the following morning. They cut the rope from my wrists. They gave me water and shelter, and when Sheriff Holloway arrived with a warrant for their arrest, they allowed me to speak on their behalf because they are men who keep their word and their hands clean, and because the truth was available to anyone willing to stand still long enough to hear it." She reached into the case and withdrew the geological survey. She held it up so the letterhead was visible to the people nearest the steps. "This document was found on the Harlow property buried beneath the floor of their barn. It is a geological survey conducted in 1870 by a consultant named Warren Alcott, commissioned by an organization called Ashford Western Land Trust of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It describes a significant underground water system beneath the eastern section of the Harlow land." She watched their faces. She watched the information travel from the front of the crowd back person to person, the way news travels through a community that already suspected something and is now being given the words for it. "This document," she said, withdrawing the second paper, "is a contract between the same Ashford Western Land Trust and the Union Pacific Railroad Company, dated November of 1871. In this contract, Victor Ashford warranted clear legal title to the Harlow water rights as collateral for a significant financial arrangement with the railroad." She let this sit for a moment. "In November of 1871, this land belonged to the Harlow family, as it does today. Victor Ashford pledged property he did not own to a federally chartered railroad in a contractual arrangement that constitutes fraud under federal commercial law." The silence had a different quality now. Douglas Crane has spent 4 years attempting to acquire the Harlow land through means that include the manufacture of false legal challenges, the deliberate disruption of neighboring ranchers' operations, and the arrangement of my abduction and intended death. She looked at Crane directly for the first time. "He is Ashford's instrument in this county. The plan was to remove the Harlow brothers through a false criminal accusation so that the land could be acquired through forced sale and the fraudulent railroad contract legitimized. The advertisement that brought me to Wyoming was part of that plan." She looked at Wendell Holloway. "These documents have been copied and transmitted to the Federal Circuit Court in Cheyenne. A formal inquiry has been opened. A federal marshal has been requested." She paused. "There is nothing left here that can be managed locally. What there is a record, and the record says what it says." She closed the case. The crowd did not erupt into noise. What it did was more interesting than noise. It went through a rearrangement, subtle and total, the kind that happens when a community that has been holding a weight for years is suddenly permitted to set it down. Henderson crossed the open ground from his position and stood beside the church steps. Walsh followed. The Patterson brothers moved from the edges to the center. Martha Jenkins turned from Grace to look at Douglas Crane with the flat, patient eyes of a woman who has been right about something for a long time. Crane started to say something. Cole Harlow took one step forward from where he had been standing behind Grace, and the step was enough. It was a single step in Cole's direction that Crane's voice ran into, like a wall, and the sentence ended before it was a sentence. Ray Holloway moved. He did not move toward Grace or toward the church steps or toward Crane. He turned and walked north along the road the way you walk when you have decided something, and the deciding is over and what is left is only the walking. Wendell Holloway watched his son go, and his face did what faces do when a weight they have been carrying for 18 years is lifted by circumstances rather than by choice. He put his hand into his coat and took out the badge and looked at it in his palm. He crossed the ground to where Reverend Cornelius Hale was standing in the church doorway. He held out the badge. "I'll send for the federal marshal myself," Holloway said, "and I'll give him everything I have." Hale accepted the badge with the expression of a man who is not entirely surprised by anything that happens in the physical world, but maintains as a professional commitment a capacity to register it. Grace was still standing on the church steps when she became aware that the quality of the morning had changed, the specific change that happens when something that has been building pressure for a long time releases it, and the air goes different. She looked at the three brothers positioned around the ground below her. Ethan to her right, Cole, where he had stepped to Jamie at the far edge of the crowd with his hand on the shoulder of a small boy who had pressed against him, and she understood that what she had done here had not ended anything. But it had moved the weight from the people who should never have been asked to carry it. Douglas Crane was not a man who accepted the ending of his arrangements gracefully. She saw this in the moment she came down from the steps when his horse moved and his voice came loud and flat. The voice of a man abandoning the civil pretense. "This is not finished, Harlow. This land will not Crane." Ethan said it from where he stood, and he said it the way a word is said when a man has finished deciding what he is going to do and is past the point of discussion. Not loud, not a threat. Something more final than a threat, the note of a man who will do exactly what he does not need to say he will do. Crane's horse shifted. He looked at Ethan Harlow across the open ground and received in the amber eyes looking steadily back at him. The quality of a man who has survived worse than this and is prepared to survive whatever comes next, and who has enough left to make whatever comes next very costly for anyone who initiates it. Crane put his hand on his reins. "You will face a federal court," Ethan said. "Not this, not me. The law. I would considerably rather you answer to the law than to anything else." A pause. "That is not a threat. That is a preference, Ross." Crane looked at the people arranged around the church ground. He looked at Henderson and Walsh and the neighbors who had been waiting for years for a morning like this. He looked at the documents in Grace Whitmore's leather case. He did not get down from his horse. Not yet. What he did instead was what Grace had not accounted for, and what Cole had spent the entire morning anticipating. He sent a rider north. One of his men quiet gone from the edge of the church ground before anyone fully registered his absence, heading out of Dry Creek at a walk that became a gallop once the town's last building was behind him. His instructions were simple and had been given the night before as a contingency. If the morning failed, the ranch was to be taken. Cole had been watching Crane's men the way a man watches something he knows is still dangerous and has only paused. He registered the departure and said 2 words to Ethan low and without turning his head. He sent someone north. Ethan was already looking at the road. What followed happened faster than it should have been possible. And it was possible because Cole Harlow had spent the previous 48 hours putting certain things in certain places. Henderson's 2 sons had ridden to the ranch before dawn that morning and were posted at the high ground east of the barn with instructions Cole had given them before the church gathering even began. Walsh and one of the Patterson brothers were at the north fence line. The other Patterson was on the ridge above the creek. The rider Crane sent north met a man named Walsh on a black horse before he cleared 2 miles, and Walsh had not ridden all night to stand aside. But Crane's full complement of 30 men did not wait for the rider's report. They came from the south tree line in the same direction the torch throwers had come weeks before, with the addition of numbers and the subtraction of patience, and what they found when they reached the Harlow Gate was not an empty ranch waiting to be taken. Cole had left the church ground the moment he sent his warning to Ethan. He was on the barn roof when the first of Crane's men cleared the fence line. He had positioned himself there before the church gathering began, which was something Grace understood only later, that Cole had anticipated exactly this contingency and arranged himself for it before the morning started, standing at the church ground with the contained stillness of a man who has left something important running behind him and trusts it to run correctly. Ethan came hard from the south road on horseback, arriving through the dust, with Henderson's older son at his left and the younger Patterson brother at his right. And what the men at the Harlow Gate discovered was that the accounting of the situation had been wrong from the start. It was not 3 brothers and a woman from Boston. It was 3 brothers and a woman from Boston and 7 neighbors who had been waiting years for permission to stand up together, and who had needed only the morning's events at the church to give them that permission in full. Cole from the rooftop reading the yard the way he had read it for 20 years. Ethan moving through the familiar ground with the efficiency of a man who has fought in worse terrain, under worse conditions, and knows that geography is the most reliable ally available. Walsh and Henderson closing the approaches. Jamie, who had ridden from the church ahead of the others by a route only he knew at the north gate. Crane's hired men had arrived expecting 3 ranchers and an empty house. They had arrived instead at a valley that had made a decision. The decision was visible in every position, every fence line, every rifle. They held their ground for less time than the torch throwers had held theirs. When the last of them had gone south toward the road, and the yard was quiet again, in the loaded way of a place where violence has passed through and left the air unsettled, Ethan dismounted by the fence rail. His left shoulder was carrying something new alongside the old wound. He did not mention this. Cole came down from the roof. He stood beside Ethan and looked at the gate and the road beyond it, and neither of them said anything for a time because there was nothing that needed saying that the morning had not already said. Grace arrived from the church road with Jamie and found them standing like that. "The ranch," Ethan said when he saw her. "Stands," Cole said. "Built this with our own hands," she thought, "not letting it go." "Yes," she said, "it does." Douglas Crane, facing the combined weight of the public accounting and the failure of his contingency, got down from his horse at the church ground 40 minutes after Grace had closed her leather case. There was no drama in it. There was a man getting off his horse in the cold morning light with the deflated deliberateness of someone who has run the calculation and found the numbers no longer support continuing. Victor Ashford was brought out of the Crane building by the pressure of circumstance, in the presence of 3 men Cole had sent to flank the building's back exit when the morning started. He came into the light looking like what he was, a man who had spent his life managing from behind other people and had now run out of people to manage from behind. Grace stood at the church steps and watched him cross the ground toward the small assembly that had formed around Wendell Holloway and Reverend Hale, and she thought about the wax seal on the letters in her father's study and the smooth, expensive voice she had heard through a wall at age 19, and the document he had signed in November 1871, pledging what was not his, and she felt something that was not exactly satisfaction, but was what comes after a long effort arrives at its correct conclusion. She looked at the brass button in her coat pocket, the one from the Philadelphia tailor, the one that had landed in the dirt of the Harlow yard during the night of the fire. She set it on the church step. She did not need it anymore. The documents were enough. The documents had always been enough. What had taken time was getting them into a place where they could be seen. The federal marshal arrived in Dry Creek 3 days later, a tall, spare man from Cheyenne named Calloway, who read through Grace's documentation with the focused attention of someone who has been looking for exactly this kind of case, for exactly this kind of trust, and who said very little but wrote a great deal in his notebook. Crane and Ashford both left Dry Creek in the marshal's custody on the 4th day, And what followed in the weeks and months afterward, in the federal courts and in the corporate offices of the railroad and in the legal journals of Philadelphia, was lengthy and complex and entirely outside the daily life of the Harlow Ranch, which continued as it always had, according to the seasons and the work and the rhythm of a place that endures. The fraudulent contract with Union Pacific was voided. The Harlow land title was formally clarified and confirmed by the Federal Circuit. Ashford Western Land Trust was dissolved under investigation, and its principals, Ashford Principal, among them, faced proceedings that would occupy the federal courts well into the following year. Thomas Whitmore received a letter from a federal attorney in Philadelphia that confirmed the voiding of the arrangements Ashford had used against him, and the debt dissolved along with the organization that had held it. He read the letter twice standing at the kitchen table on Hanover Street, and then he sat down in the chair by the window and put his face in his hands for a few minutes, not from grief, but from the release of a man who has been holding himself rigid against something for too long. His daughter sent him a telegram the same week that said, "Safe, happy, come west in the spring." A week after the marshal left Dry Creek, Grace Whitmore sat on the porch of the Harlow cabin in the last of the autumn light and wrote a letter to her father that she had been composing in pieces for several weeks. She told him about the garden she had turned in October and what it would yield in the spring if the winter was kind. She told him about the gray horse that Jamie had brought back from lameness, and that was now the steadiest of the working string. She told him about the eastern section of the land, the unworked ground above the water, and what they planned to do with it when the time came, which was not to sell it and not to exploit it, but to tend it with the same care you give to anything worth keeping. She did not tell him everything because letters cannot hold everything, but she told him enough. Ethan came to her door in the late afternoon a week after the marshal had gone, and the valley had returned to the ordinary business of preparing for winter. The light through the cabin window was the amber of a late October afternoon in Wyoming, the kind that turns the dust on the floor to something resembling gold and makes everything look slightly more permanent than usual. He sat across from her at the table. His hands were on the wood in front of him, open the way she had first noticed them in the burnt door when he had said his name and told her he had not written the letter. "You don't owe this place anything," he said. "The reason you came here was built on a lie. Your father is free. The situation is resolved." He looked at his hands. "You could go back to Boston. A federal court has remedies for what was done to you. There would be no shame in it." She looked at him. She had been waiting for this conversation not impatiently, but with the awareness that it was coming the way you are aware of weather moving in from the west when you have learned to read the sky. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "Do you want me to go?" The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the last of the cattle were moving toward the near pasture fence. Cole's voice came from somewhere near the barn, saying something to Jamie that resolved into laughter, which was still a sound that surprised her slightly. Cole's laugh because it was infrequent enough to retain its full weight every time it came. "No," he said. "I don't." She had known this before he said it. She had known it in the way you know things when you have been paying close attention to a person for 6 weeks in the circumstances of shared danger and shared work and shared mornings at a table, which are the circumstances most likely to show you who a person actually is. "Then I will stay," she said, "not because I have nowhere to go, not because of circumstances or contracts or what I came here expecting to find, because I choose to." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is the only reason I would accept," he said. She put her hand on the table between them, palm down, not reaching across, simply placed present, available. He looked at it. Then he put his hand over hers, large and warm, and calloused the hand of a man who builds things and fixes things and tends things, and the weight of it was the most certain thing she had felt since she stepped off the stagecoach into a world she did not know. From the kitchen doorway, Jamie's voice, "Ethan, coffee's on." "Yes," Ethan said, not moving. "Grace," Jamie called. "Please," she said. She heard Jamie tell Cole something too low to make out, and Cole's response, and the sound of the cabin going about its ordinary business around them. The fire, the coffee, the closing of the barn door. The small sounds of a place that has people in it who belong there. Ethan Harlow and Grace Whitmore sat at the table in the amber light and did not speak for a time that was exactly long enough. Reverend Cornelius Hale performed the wedding ceremony 3 weeks later on a Sunday afternoon in the cold November light outside the Dry Creek Church, because the church itself was not large enough for the people who came. They came from all through the valley. Henderson and his family, Walsh and the Pattersons, old McCready from the North End, who had not attended a social occasion in 4 years, and came to this one in a clean shirt that showed the creases of long storage. Martha Jenkins stood in the front and cried without any apology. And when someone asked her afterward why, she said, "Because I always do, and also because someone needed to." And both of these things were entirely true. Amos Pratt stood near the back with his hands in his coat pockets and watched everything with the contained intensity of a boy filing it all away. The names and the details and the quality of the afternoon, because he had already understood at 12 that the things worth remembering were the things worth recording. The ceremony was short in the way that ceremonies are short when the two people standing in front of the minister have already said the essential things to each other in a cabin kitchen with bad lighting and cold coffee going undrunk on the table. And what is left for the ceremony to do is simply to make the essential things official. Ethan stood very still in his good coat and said his words without looking away from her face. And what he said was not the standard form, but his own version of it, compressed and plain, which was the only way he said anything. "I will never lie to you, and I will never raise my hand against you. That much I promised in a letter I never wrote. I am making it now in what I mean." Grace heard in those words the echo of the advertisement in the Boston Chronicle, the letter she had read 3 times by the window light on Hanover Street, the sentence she had underlined in pencil, and then pretended not to have underlined, and she understood that the world sometimes works in circular ways that only become visible when you are standing at the place the circle closes. She said her words plainly and meant every one of them. Cole stood as witness with the expression of a man who has arrived at something he did not plan for and finds it on consideration acceptable in the deepest possible sense. Jamie stood beside him and made no attempt to contain any of what he was feeling, which was considerable and which expressed itself in a broad, uncomplicated happiness that was entirely characteristic of him and entirely right for the afternoon. The valley held the cold light long that November day, the hills going purple and then dark around the edges, while the sky stayed gold at the center, and the people of Dry Creek who had come for this stood in that light and felt the warmth of a community that has been through something and come out of it with its better parts intact. "You're home now," Jamie said to Grace on the walk back from the ceremony, not in the formal tone of a pronouncement, but in the casual tone of a statement of obvious fact that had been true for some time and was simply being said aloud for the first time. She did not answer. She took his arm, and they walked together through the cold afternoon toward the warmth of the cabin where the fire was already going, and it was enough. 25 years is not a long time when you are looking forward toward it. Standing at the beginning of a life and trying to imagine what it will be in 25 years is an exercise in necessary fiction, because the imagination cannot hold what actual living fills in. 25 years is a very long time when you are standing inside it, when it is the medium you move through every day, when the small things accumulate into the texture of a shared existence. And the shared existence becomes something you could not have designed from the outside looking in. Grace Harlow understood this by the time the summer of 1897 came to the valley. The ranch had changed in the ways that things change when they are properly tended, not dramatically, but through the addition of what was needed and the replacement of what wore out and the gradual expansion of what worked. The cabin had been extended twice. The barn had been rebuilt after a fire in the winter of 1879 that had taken the original structure down to the stone foundation, but no further, because Cole had woken at the first smell of smoke and done what Cole did, which was to get ahead of the problem before it could finish becoming one. The kitchen garden had grown from the neglected beds Grace had found in October of 1872 into a walled plot that produced more than the household needed through 3 seasons, and was the source of considerable commerce with the town and no small amount of pride. The eastern section of the land, the ground above the water, remained what it had been. Not sold, not exploited, not pledged to any railroad or trust or investment scheme. Tended, grazed in rotation, rested in seasons, managed with the long view that takes into account not the next year but the next generation. The water stayed clean and the grass stayed good, and the land did what it does when it is respected, which is to give back in proportion to what it receives. Jamie married a school teacher named Sarah Alderton from Laramie. In the spring of 1878, a small, decisive woman with red hair and a conviction about the importance of reading that she and Jamie discovered they shared completely, which was the foundation that everything else in their life together was built on. Their house went up in the summer of that year on the western edge of the ranch property, and the sound of children in it began the following year and continued at regular intervals for the better part of a decade. Their eldest daughter could read before she was 5. Their youngest son could name every bone in a horse's leg before he was 7, which was Jamie's contribution to the household's educational priorities. Cole married Margaret Aldis, a woman who had come to Wyoming from Ohio with her widowed aunt and had the additional quality of being the only person Cole Harlow had ever met who could outlast him in an argument without raising her voice. Cole built her a house without telling anyone he was building it, which was entirely characteristic of him, and when it was finished, he brought her to see it on a Tuesday afternoon and described it as practical, which she recognized correctly as the highest praise he was capable of offering for anything. The children that came to the Harlow Ranch over those 25 years learned certain things without being formally taught them. They learned that the land was something you worked with rather than something you worked against. They learned that silence between people who know each other well is a form of conversation rather than an absence of one. They learned that the hardest winters were the ones that made the springs feel like what they were, which was a second chance available every year to anyone willing to survive to receive it. In the winter of 1884, the valley saw its worst cold in 20 years. The grass was gone by December, and the hay supplies ran low by February, and the cattle losses were significant across every property from the North Hills to the creek line. 3 of the Harlow cattle died in a single week. Cole's right hand sustained a cold injury that would give him trouble in wet weather for the rest of his life. The children were kept indoors for days at a time during the worst of it, and the cabin held everyone it needed to hold with the solidity of a structure that had been built to last. Ethan worked through that winter in the way he had worked through every difficult thing in his life, steadily and without complaint, and with the economy of effort that comes from a man who has learned not to waste what he has because he knows the difference between temporary scarcity and the permanent kind. He came in one night in February after 30 hours of continuous work, snow in his beard and ice along the brim of his hat, and Grace was at the fire, and she did not say anything, but stood and took his coat and pressed a cup of coffee into his hands and held them around it until the shaking eased. "Winter always ends," she said. He looked at her over the cup. 24 years of marriage and the amber eyes still carried in them the same qualities she had first seen in the barn door, the attentiveness of a person who gives their full presence as a commitment. The lines around them were deeper now, and the temples were silver, and the left shoulder still carried its old ache in the cold. But the eyes were the same. "It does," he said. Thomas Whitmore came west in the spring of 1876, the year after the birth of his grandson Thomas, who had been named for him with the directness that characterized most decisions in the Harlow household. He arrived by rail to Cheyenne and by stage from there, and stood in the yard of the ranch on a May morning with the look of a man trying to take in more than his vision can accommodate all at once. The valley was at its best in May, the hills green from the snowmelt and the creek running full, and the meadows showing the short, bright wildflowers that would be gone again in 6 weeks. It was not Boston in any sense and made no effort to be, and Thomas Whitmore stood in it with the careful face of a man adjusting his understanding of something he thought he knew. Ethan met him in the yard and shook his hand. He was 6 inches taller than Thomas Whitmore and considerably broader and considerably quieter. And what passed between them in that handshake and the brief exchange of words that followed it was the essential communication between two men who both loved the same woman and both understand, without needing to say it, what that means about what they owe each other. Thomas Whitmore stayed for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks, he learned to be in a place that was not like anything he had known before, and he went home to Boston with a letter from Grace that he read 3 times on the train east, which was a habit of his daughter's he had apparently inherited. He came back the following spring, and the one after that, and eventually the visits became a matter of course, the way things become a matter of course when they fit correctly into the shape of a life. The summer of 1897 settled into the valley like it belonged there, warm and long-shadowed, the hills holding their green late into July. The expanded cabin caught the morning light through the window that Ethan had added to the east wall in 1885, which Grace had wanted since she first stood in the original cabin and assessed its orientation to the light, and which he had added finally on a spring morning without announcement, moving the framing lumber into position in the way he moved all things with the quiet intention of a man who decides something and then does it. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cool beside her when she became aware of the quality of that morning, the warmth and the angle of the light and the sound coming through the open door of 3 children chasing each other through the front yard with the focused urgency of a game that had its own complete logic. One of the voices belonged to Hector Pratt's eldest grandchild, who was the granddaughter of Amos, now 37 years old, and running the telegraph office and half the county's communication infrastructure with the same efficient attention he had brought to sweeping porches at age 12. The other 2 voices belonged to Jamie's youngest grandchildren, who had come for the week from Laramie, where Jamie and Sarah had relocated the year before, when Sarah took a teaching position at the new school. Ethan came in from outside with a length of fence wire in his hand and set it on the porch and came to the kitchen and poured coffee from the pot and stood at the window, the way he had always stood at the window looking out at the valley. He was 57 years old. His hair was mostly silver now, worn the same length it had always been, and the weathering of his face had deepened into something that suited him in the way that certain things suit certain people over time. The left shoulder still carried its old weather. He had stopped trying to hide that it bothered him sometime in the early 90s, which she took as a mark of progress. She watched him at the window and thought about a September morning in 1872. A barn door, a woman lying in straw, and a man who had stood in a doorway with his hands open and said his name and told the truth before anything else. A man keeps his word, he had once said to Jamie in her hearing when Jamie was 24 and asking about a neighbor's bad dealing. She had written it in her journal. She had come to understand it as the organizing principle of everything he did not state it as a philosophy, but practiced as a way of being. She had tried to practice it herself. She thought she had mostly managed it. One of the children in the yard shrieked with delight at something, and the shriek resolved into laughter and then into a demand that someone come and see what had been found, which was apparently a toad of remarkable size near the garden wall. Ethan turned from the window and looked at her. They had spent 25 years learning the language that 2 people develop when they live together long enough, the specific vocabulary of gesture and timing and silence that says more in the end than the largest words available. She could read him across a room in the way she could read the sky above the eastern hills by the small signs, the set of his shoulders, the angle at which he held the coffee cup, the presence or absence of that slight forward lean that meant he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. He was leaning slightly forward. "Come outside," he said. She took her coffee and went with him to the porch, and they stood together, looking at the yard where the children were congregated around the garden wall with the absorbed focus of people who have discovered something worth discovering. The valley opened beyond the fence lines in every direction, the hills in the middle distance, and the higher country beyond them, holding the summer green and the sky above. Everything was the deep cloudless blue that belongs to high country on a clear day, the kind that makes the world seem very large and also somehow very close. She still remembered with the clarity that certain things retain, stepping off that stagecoach in September of 1872 into nothing, into dust and failing light, in a man who was not who he said he was, in a destination that was not what the letter had promised. She had stood in that light with her traveling trunk and her folded knife in her bag, in the steady determination of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and is going to do it regardless of how it looks from the outside. She had not known then what she was walking toward. She had not known about the barn or the bound wrists or the amber-eyed man who would stand in a doorway with his hands open and change the direction of everything. She had not known about the kitchen garden or the geological survey or the federal marshal or the November afternoon in front of the church or the winter of 1884 that they had come through together, or the children or the grandchildren of Amos Pratt chasing toads near the garden wall. She had not known that the world sometimes works in circular ways that only become visible when you are standing at the place the circle closes. She knew it now. One of Jamie's grandchildren ran toward the porch and stopped at the steps and looked up at Ethan with the unself-conscious directness of the very young. "Are you coming to see?" the boy said. Ethan looked down at him. He looked at Grace. He set his coffee cup on the porch rail. "Yes," he said. "I am." He went down the steps toward the garden, and the boy took his hand with the completeness of a child who has never been given a reason not to trust the large hands of the people who are present for them, and Grace stood on the porch and watched them go, and the Wyoming summer held everything in its long light, and the valley was as it had always been, patient and open and entirely indifferent to the smallness of individual lives, while providing without commentary exactly what those lives required to become what they were meant to become. She thought about a line she had written in her journal in those first days. She could not remember exactly when. Sometime in October, in the amber light of the cabin kitchen, after a day of work in the garden, or a night of documents spread across the table, or some other ordinary day that she had not known was building toward anything. I came west looking for an honest life. I did not know yet what that meant. She knew now. She picked up Ethan's coffee cup from the rail. She went inside to warm it up. She came back out to the porch and stood in the summer morning, and the sound of the children, and the smell of the garden, and the sight of her husband crouching in the dirt beside a boy who was showing him a toad. With the seriousness of a significant discovery, all of it was present around her in the way that things are present when you are not in a hurry to be anywhere else. Right where you belong, Jamie had told her on a November afternoon 25 years ago, walking back from the church in the cold. She had not answered then because the answer was too large for words on a cold afternoon with the ceremony still warm in her. She had the answer now. She had had it for a long time.